Picture this. It's the summer of 356 BCE in the ancient kingdom of Macedon, and the night sky is glowing with strange, fiery streaks. In the city of Pella, Queen Olympias gives birth to a boy who will change the world. His father, King Philip II, is away preparing for war, but when word reaches him, so do the omens. Some say the Temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the world, burns down the same night. As if the gods are clearing space for something greater, others whisper that Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her womb, a sign that the child inside was touched by Zeus himself. From the very beginning, Alexander's life is wrapped in myth, his parents stoking his belief that he is destined for greatness. But destiny alone doesn't create a conqueror. Macedon was no golden palace of peace. It was a rough, war hardened kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, caught between the cultured city states to the south and the wild, unpredictable tribes to the north. Philip, a brilliant but ruthless ruler, had transformed the Macedonian army into an unstoppable phalanx, and from the moment Alexander could walk, he was surrounded by the smell of leather armor and the ring of steel on steel. Olympias, fiercely protective and deeply religious, told her son he was descended not just from mortal kings, but from heroes like Achilles, and she made sure he believed it. Alexander grew up hearing tales of epic battles, divine intervention, and glory that outlived death, stories that would fuse with his own ambition until he could no longer separate legend from reality. Even as a boy, there were signs of something different about him. He tamed a wild horse named Bucephalus when no one else could, simply by understanding its fear, a moment that made Philip declare, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you." And in that single sentence, the stage was set. Alexander wasn't meant to rule just a kingdom. He was meant to conquer the world. But the world wouldn't simply hand itself over. And soon, the boy born under omens would face the first tests that would shape the man who would be called great. By the time Alexander was old enough to truly start shaping his mind, King Philip knew his son needed more than just lessons in swordplay. He needed the sharpest mind in Greece to mold him, and so Philip hires none other than Aristotle, the philosopher who had studied under Plato, who had studied under Socrates, giving Alexander a direct intellectual bloodline back to the very founders of Western thought. Picture it, a teenage prince sitting under the shade of trees in Mieza, away from the politics of Pella, learning about ethics, logic, science, medicine, poetry, and the workings of the known world. Aristotle didn't just lecture, he fed Alexander an entire worldview. He taught him that reason and observation were the keys to understanding life, but he also planted the seeds of a dangerous idea that the Greeks were superior to all other peoples. This belief would become both a driving force and a fatal flaw in Alexander's ambitions. Yet it wasn't all lofty philosophy. Alexander devoured Homer's Iliad, carrying a copy annotated by Aristotle himself wherever he went, seeing in Achilles a reflection of the hero he wanted to be. The education was practical too. Aristotle schooled him in politics, geography, and medicine, even teaching him how to treat his soldiers in the field. But behind the classroom walls, Alexander's ambitions were already sharpening. He wasn't just thinking about ruling Macedon, he was imagining entire continents bending to his will. And as he absorbed Aristotle's lessons, he was also learning from his father, watching Philip expand Macedon's borders with military genius, forging alliances, breaking enemies, and playing the Greek city-states against each other like pieces on a chessboard. The boy was becoming a man with the mind of a philosopher and the instincts of a predator. But while Alexander was still in training, the world outside was boiling. Rebellions, rival kings, and empires ripe for the taking. And soon he would step onto the battlefield for the first time, where all of Aristotle's wisdom would meet the brutal test of blood and steel. By the time Alexander was 16, the training wheels were off, both mentally and militarily. His father Philip was deep into his campaign to dominate Greece. And when he marched south to handle business elsewhere, he left young Alexander in charge of Macedon itself. Imagine that. Barely old enough to shave and already regent of a kingdom. Most teenagers would have been overwhelmed, but Alexander wasn't most teenagers. Almost immediately, a Thracian tribe to the north decided this was the perfect time to test Macedon's resolve, assuming the boy prince would fold under pressure. Instead, Alexander led the army himself, crushed the rebels, founded a city in their territory, and named it Alexandropolis, naturally, before riding home as if it were just another day. But his real moment in the spotlight came in 338 BCE at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip faced a coalition of Athens and Thebes, the heavyweights of the Greek world. Alexander, only 18, commanded the left wing of the Macedonian army, directly facing the elite sacred band of Thebes, a unit so feared and disciplined that they'd crushed Spartan armies in the past. As the main Macedonian line engaged, Alexander spotted his moment. He led a daring cavalry charge, breaking through the Theban flank and scattering the sacred band. By the end of the day, Athens was in retreat, Thebes was shattered, and Philip controlled all of Greece. And yet, even in victory, the whispers began that it was Alexander's charge that had tipped the battle, that perhaps the son was already outshining the father. For Philip, this was both a source of pride and a potential problem, because power is never shared easily, and a brilliant heir is as much a threat as an asset. But for Alexander, the taste of command, the thrill of victory, and the roar of soldiers shouting his name lit a fire that could not be extinguished. The boy had proven himself a warrior. Now all he needed was a crown, and fate, as it so often does in history, was already sharpening the knife that would put it in his hands. The year is 336 BCE, and Macedon is at the height of its power under King Philip II. The Greek city-states are subdued, alliances secured, and Philip is preparing to launch an unprecedented invasion of the Persian Empire. But at the royal wedding banquet, a night meant to celebrate unity, blood spills on the marble floor. As the guests drink and feast, Philip strides into the theater to take his seat, only for one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias, to rush forward and plunge a dagger into his chest. Chaos erupts. Some say it was a personal grievance. Others whisper it was a political plot, maybe even orchestrated by Olympias, Alexander's fiercely ambitious mother, or by Persia itself to stop the coming war. Regardless of who was behind it, one fact was certain: Philip was dead, and the throne was suddenly empty. In the blink of an eye, Alexander, just 20 years old, stood on the edge of a deadly cliff, because in Macedon, a new king didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited rivals, conspirators, and enemies eager to test his strength. Within days, Alexander moved with the precision of a seasoned predator. He eliminated potential claimants to the throne, secured the loyalty of the army, and asserted his authority over the Greek city-states by marching south in a show of force. When Thebes and Athens began murmuring about independence, Alexander didn't send letters. He sent soldiers, surrounding Thebes so completely that the city was obliterated, its people slaughtered or sold into slavery. It was a message written in blood. The new king was not to be underestimated. Greece bent the knee, the Macedonian nobility fell in line, and the army, the finest in the known world, swore its loyalty to Alexander. And so, with his home secure and his enemies either crushed or cowed, the young king turned his gaze eastward. The Persian Empire, vast, ancient, and wealthy beyond imagining, awaited him across the Hellespont. Philip had dreamed of conquering it. Alexander was about to make that dream his own and turn it into something far greater. In the spring of 334 BCE, the wind off the Aegean carried the scent of salt and destiny as Alexander stood at the edge of the Hellespont, the narrow strip of water separating Europe from Asia. Behind him, a hardened army of some 40,000 men, veterans of his father's campaigns and new recruits eager to follow the young king into glory. Before him, the vast Persian Empire stretching from the coast of Asia Minor to the mountains of India. Crossing in a fleet of ships, Alexander made sure the act was more than just a logistical step. It was a declaration. Legend says that upon landing, he leapt ashore fully armed, threw a spear into the ground, and claimed Asia as a gift from the gods. But he didn't just want conquest, he wanted to honor his heroes. Traveling to the ruins of Troy, he offered sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles, the warrior he had idolized since boyhood, cementing the idea in his soldiers' minds that they were part of a new epic. The Persians didn't make him wait long. At the river Granicus, a Persian satrap gathered cavalry and Greek mercenaries to smash the Macedonians before they could move inland. The Persian generals assumed the young king would hesitate, but Alexander did the opposite, charging straight into the river under a hail of arrows. In the chaos, he cut down enemy leaders personally, his helmet plumes making him a clear target, but also rallying his men to push harder. The Persian line broke, their cavalry scattered, and the Greek mercenaries were surrounded and slaughtered. The victory was swift, brutal, and a statement to the world. The boy king from Macedon was here, and he wasn't going home until the Persian Empire was his. City after city in Asia Minor opened its gates to him, some willingly, others after being forced. The invasion had begun, the momentum was his, and somewhere deep in the empire, King Darius III was realizing that this was no minor border raid. This was a storm coming straight for his throne. By late 333 BCE, Alexander had swept through Asia Minor like a wildfire, capturing coastal cities and dismantling Persian control piece by piece, but he knew the real test was still ahead, King Darius III himself. That test came at Issus, a narrow coastal plain in modern day Turkey where fate trapped the vastly larger Persian army in tight terrain. Darius had chosen this ground thinking Alexander was retreating, but in truth, the Macedonian king was already turning to strike. The numbers were staggering. Estimates say Darius commanded over 100,000 men, while Alexander had barely a third of that. But Alexander's army was forged from iron discipline, drilled in Philip's unbreakable phalanx tactics, and led by a man who lived for moments like this. As dawn broke, the two armies faced each other across the Pinarus River, the air thick with tension. Alexander personally led the right wing, aiming straight for Darius himself, while Parmenion commanded the left against relentless Persian cavalry attacks. At the signal, Alexander's men surged forward, the sarissas, those massive Macedonian spears, forming a wall of death. The clash was brutal, with arrows raining down and swords flashing in the chaos, but Alexander's focus never wavered. Break the center, reach the king. At the perfect moment, he formed his cavalry into a wedge and drove it like a spearhead straight into the Persian heart. The Macedonian charge punched through, and as Alexander's men cut down the guards around Darius's chariot, the great king panicked and fled the battlefield, leaving his family, his treasury, and his honor behind. The Persian lines collapsed, the rout was complete, and the young Macedonians stood victorious over the most powerful monarch in the known world. But Alexander didn't kill Darius's captured family. Instead, he treated them with respect, earning both their loyalty and the admiration of his own men. Still, he knew the war wasn't over. Darius was alive, regrouping, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the rest of the Persian Empire waited, along with treasures, cities, and dangers unlike anything Alexander had faced before. After Issus, Alexander had two choices: chase Darius east into the Persian heartland, or turn south and rip away the empire's lifeline, its naval bases, and the wealth of Egypt. He chose the latter because Alexander didn't just think like a general, he thought like a chess player, always cutting off his enemy's next move. Sweeping down the Levantine coast, he took city after city, but not without resistance. At Tyre, a fortified island city half a mile offshore, the Tyrians laughed at the idea that anyone could breach their walls. Alexander built a causeway through the sea, dragged siege towers across it under constant attack, and after 7 months of grueling siege, stormed the city in one of the most audacious assaults in ancient history. With the Persian fleet bases gone, Egypt was next, and here fate seemed to roll out a golden carpet. The Egyptians, long under Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator, hailing him as pharaoh. He entered Memphis without a fight, restored traditional religious rites, and positioned himself not just as a conqueror, but as a rightful ruler. But Alexander wasn't done shaping his own legend. He founded a city at the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria, which he envisioned as a hub of culture, trade, and power that would outlive him. Then, in one of his most mysterious moves, he trekked across the unforgiving Libyan desert to the Siwa oasis, seeking the oracle of Ammon. No one knows exactly what was said in the sanctuary, only that the priest greeted Alexander as the son of the god, and whatever he heard there, he never revealed. Whether it was prophecy, flattery, or both, Alexander left Egypt with more than just territory. He left with the aura of divinity, the belief that his destiny was not merely to rule men, but to reshape the world itself. And with Egypt secured, his eyes turned east once more, where Darius waited with an army even larger than before, ready for a confrontation that would decide the fate of an empire. It was October 331 BCE, and the stage was set for the battle that would decide the fate of the ancient world. Darius III had learned from his mistakes at Issus. This time, he chose his ground carefully, a vast open plain near the village of Gaugamela, perfect for unleashing his massive cavalry and war chariots. Estimates put the Persian force at over 200,000 men, a tidal wave of soldiers, archers, and armored beasts, while Alexander brought barely 47,000. But numbers had never been his weakness. Precision was. As dawn broke, the two armies faced each other, the Persian line stretching so far it seemed to vanish into the horizon. Darius stood in the center on a chariot gleaming with gold, flanked by elite guards, ready to crush the upstart Macedonian once and for all. Alexander, calm and calculating, positioned his forces with surgical intent. Parmenion on the left to hold against the Persian cavalry, Alexander himself on the right, poised like a drawn bowstring. When the signal came, the Persians surged forward, chariots thundering toward the Macedonian lines. But Alexander's men simply stepped aside at the last moment, spearmen striking the drivers and horses as they passed, turning the terrifying chariots into burning wrecks. Then came Alexander's masterstroke, a feigned retreat on his right flank that lured a massive portion of the Persian cavalry away, opening a gap in their center. Seizing the moment, Alexander formed his companion cavalry into a wedge and drove straight through that gap, heading directly for Darius. The sight of the Macedonian king charging at him broke the great king's nerve. Just as at Issus, Darius turned and fled, his chariot rattling away into the distance. The Persian army collapsed, and by the day's end, Alexander was master of Mesopotamia. Babylon surrendered, its gates thrown open in welcome. Susa followed, its treasures swelling Alexander's coffers, and then Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, fell into his hands. In a moment still debated by historians, Alexander allowed the city's great palace to be set ablaze. Whether as vengeance for the Persian sack of Athens a century earlier or a drunken celebration gone too far, the flames consumed the heart of the Achaemenid Empire. With Darius on the run and Persia in ruins, Alexander had done what no Greek before him had ever dreamed possible. He was now the king of kings. But the great king was still alive, fleeing into the east, and Alexander's hunger for pursuit would drive him to the very edges of the known world. With Persia shattered, Alexander could have stopped, taken the throne in Babylon, and ruled the largest empire the Greeks had ever known. But that was never who he was. Darius III was still alive somewhere in the east, and for Alexander, unfinished business was a poison he couldn't ignore. The pursuit dragged him across the mountains and deserts of Central Asia into lands so remote that even the Greeks had no names for them. Through scorching heat and freezing passes, he hunted the great king like a predator, only to find in 330 BCE that Darius had been betrayed and murdered by his own satrap, Bessus. Standing over the abandoned body of his old enemy, Alexander draped his cloak over the corpse and sent it back to Persia for a royal burial, a final gesture of respect to the man he had defeated but never personally killed. But with Darius gone, Alexander's ambition didn't fade, it grew. He declared himself the rightful ruler of the Persian Empire, adopting Persian dress and customs, even demanding proskynesis, the act of bowing before him, from both Persian nobles and his Macedonian companions, a move that stirred resentment among his old comrades. His journey into the far reaches of Bactria introduced him to Roxana, the daughter of a local noble, whom he married in a union that was both political and personal, binding the new eastern territories to his rule. Yet even this wasn't the edge of his vision. His eyes turned south and east toward India, a land whispered about in stories, rich in elephants, gems, and strange wonders. In 326 BCE, Alexander crossed the formidable Hindu Kush and faced King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River. The monsoon rains turned the battlefield into a swamp, and Porus's war elephants thundered through the mud like living fortresses, trampling men and scattering horses. But Alexander, ever the tactician, feigned weakness, crossed the river under cover of night, and hit Porus's flank in a surprise assault. The battle was savage and bloody, but in the end, Alexander won. And in a rare act of admiration, he not only spared Porus, but restored him as ruler, enlarged his territory, and called him a friend. Yet for all the victories, The army was exhausted. Years of marching, endless battles, and the crushing heat of the Indian subcontinent wore them down. And when Alexander's ambition pushed toward the unknown lands further east, his men refused to go on. For the first time in his career, the king was forced to turn back. He had reached the edge of the known world, but in his mind, there was always further to go. And the long march home would prove that the greatest battles were no longer with foreign kings, but with time, loyalty, and fate itself. The march back from India was no triumphant parade. It was a grueling test of endurance that nearly broke Alexander's army. Rather than retracing their steps, he chose a direct but deadly route through the Gedrosian desert, a decision historians still debate. The burning sun, lack of water, and endless dunes claimed thousands of lives, yet Alexander pushed on, sharing the same rations and hardships as his men, refusing to drink when there wasn't enough for all. By the time they reached Babylon in 323 BCE, the army was battered, but the king's mind was already leaping ahead to new conquests Arabia, perhaps even Carthage. The empire stretched from Greece to the fringes of India, a patchwork of cultures and lands stitched together by his will alone, and he was only 32 years old. But then, as if struck by a force he couldn't outmaneuver, Alexander fell ill after a night of heavy drinking and fever. Over the next 12 days, his condition worsened, his voice fading, his body weakening, until he could barely lift his head. His generals gathered at his bedside, desperate to know who would inherit the greatest empire the world had ever seen. When asked, Alexander is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." Whether those words were a deliberate challenge, a cryptic joke, or a fatal mistake, they set off a storm of ambition and betrayal the moment he died. On June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great, the boy who had tamed a wild horse, the king who had never lost a battle, the man who had carved his name across continents, was gone. The news hit his empire like a thunderclap. Without a clear successor, his generals, the Diadochi, tore the empire apart in decades of brutal wars, each carving out their own kingdoms from the corpse of his dream. And yet, even as the political map dissolved, Alexander's legacy endured. He had fused East and West in ways no one had before, spreading Greek language, art, and ideas across Asia, while absorbing elements of Persian, Egyptian, and Indian culture into his vision of rulership. Cities he founded became centers of learning and trade for centuries. The very idea of a world empire carried his shadow. His life was a blaze that burned impossibly bright and ended far too soon, but the light it cast changed the course of history forever. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, the name Alexander is still spoken with awe, not just as a conqueror, but as the embodiment of ambition without limits, the man who looked at the known world and saw it as nothing more than the beginning.